This is the story of a life lost before it even had the chance to truly begin. A story of unimaginable cruelty and betrayal. A 5-month-old baby. A tiny, innocent life, whose trust was broken in the most violent way possible. Her name was Brianna Lopez, and the crime that would take her life is one so brutal, so horrific, that no one could have seen it coming. The most horrific case police has ever seen in New Mexico. The hands that should have held her with love. Those same hands, her parents, were the ones that caused her pain, fear, and ultimately death. How could this happen? How could someone so young, so pure, suffer a fate so violent at the hands of the people who were supposed to protect her? What could drive a mother, a father, and an uncle to turn their own flesh and blood into a victim of cruelty? Stay with us, because the truth you're about to hear is one that will shake you to your core. As we walk through this tragic case, we'll reveal how family, those who should have kept Brianna safe, became her worst nightmare. A betrayal no one could have imagined. The pain Brianna experienced isn't just something we're going to talk about. We're going to show you the real, heart-wrenching details that will leave you questioning everything you think you know about abuse, neglect, and the failure of those meant to protect us. This case isn't just a tragic story about a child who was taken too soon. No. It's a warning, a call to action to everyone to look harder, listen more closely, and take action when the signs of abuse are staring us in the face. This was a family in crisis, a household that appeared on the outside like any other. But behind closed doors, it was a house of horrors, a place where one of the most vulnerable among us was the target of brutality. Imagine being only 5 months old, completely dependent on your parents, helpless, and the very people who should have been your greatest protectors, the ones who should have loved you, were the ones who caused you the most pain. What should have been a life of love, care, and warmth, instead became one of suffering, isolation, and neglect. The moment Brianna entered this world, Valentine's Day, she should have been surrounded by love. Instead, she was placed into a chaotic home, a home that lacked stability and safety. Born premature, Brianna's very first days were spent in a neonatal intensive care unit. A tiny warrior in the fight for her life. But little did anyone know, her fight for survival had only just begun. Her parents, Stephanie Lopez and Andrew Walters, appear to be like any other young couple. Young, overwhelmed by life's struggles, yet carrying the responsibility of caring for a newborn child. But what went unnoticed was the darkness that ran through their lives. The unseen fears, the emotional scars, and the dangerous patterns that had been festering long before Brianna was born. Andrew Walters, her father, was 21 years old, but his behavior was far from that of someone who could protect his child. Described as quick-tempered, alcoholic, and abusive, Andrew's character was a ticking time bomb that, over time, would reveal its devastating effects on Brianna. And then there was Stephanie Lopez, Brianna's mother. Only 19 years old at the time, Stephanie found herself in a chaotic relationship with Andrew, marked by emotional instability, unemployment, and a lack of support. Together, they created an environment where their child, Brianna, had no chance of escaping the darkness around her. Love, when it existed, was overshadowed by neglect, indifference, and violence. But it doesn't end there. There was another figure in Brianna's life, one who should have been a stabilizing force, a protector. Yet instead, Stephen Lopez, her uncle, played a role in the tragedy that would unfold. His presence in the home added another layer of dysfunction, and like the rest of the family, he failed to protect Brianna from the storm of abuse swirling around her. Together, these three adults, Stephanie, Andrew, and Stephen, formed a dysfunctional unit, one that would fail Brianna in the most unimaginable way. You see, this was not an isolated incident. The warning signs were there, but they were ignored, brushed aside by the people who should have taken action. And by the time Brianna's pain was undeniable, it was already too late. Her parents' failure to protect her was not just neglect. It was active cruelty, a pattern of emotional and physical abuse that stretched far beyond the surface, beyond the obvious bruises and signs of harm. But here's the part that will make you question everything you know about child protection. Brianna, so young, so innocent, was silenced by the very people who should have been the loudest voices protecting her. A life lost. A future stolen. But why? Why was this allowed to happen? Why did no one step in? Why did no one notice that something was seriously wrong? In the next few minutes, you'll hear what happens when a system meant to protect children fails them at their most vulnerable. What we'll uncover will haunt you. It will make you realize just how much we all need to pay attention to every sign, every clue, and every cry for help. And the truth. The truth will not only break your heart but also leave you searching for answers that still elude us today. Stay with us. We have much more to reveal in this tragic story. Before we dive deeper into Brianna's heartbreaking story, I just want to take a moment to thank all my amazing subscribers for supporting this channel. It's your views, comments, and shares that help us bring these important stories to light. Creating this content takes time, effort, and dedication to ensure we get every detail right, and I couldn't do it without your support. Now, if Brianna's story is already pulling at your heartstrings, like this video and subscribe to this channel so you won't miss out on the rest of her tragic story. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, because child protection starts with awareness, and we need to spread Brianna's story far and wide. Turn on the notification bell, so you'll be the first to know when we release the next part of this journey. You won't want to miss it. Brianna Lopez entered this world on February 14, 2002, a day that should have been filled with joy, a day celebrating love and new beginnings. But for Brianna, it was the start of a fight for survival, a battle she would never get to win. Born premature, she weighed only 2 pounds, 10 ounces. Tiny, fragile, but with a spirit that could not be broken. Her first days were spent in the neonatal intensive care unit NICU, surrounded by machines, beeping monitors, and the soft hum of fluorescent lights. For some, the NICU is a place of hope, a place where tiny miracles happen every day. But for Brianna, it was only the first step in a far darker journey. She fought. She fought like a warrior, even though she didn't understand what was happening. Nurses and doctors marveled at her resilience. They saw a baby who was determined to make it. But little did they know, this tiny, innocent soul would soon find herself in an environment far more dangerous than the sterile walls of the NICU. In the months that followed, Brianna's health improved. But what happened next was something no one could have ever predicted. Her parents, the ones who should have been her greatest protectors, had their own demons. Stephanie Lopez, Brianna's 19-year-old mother, was not ready for motherhood. Not in the way a mother should be. She was young, and her world was marked by instability, unemployment, and the pressures of trying to raise a child in a broken home. Stephanie's life was far from stable. Her relationship with Andrew Walters, Brianna's father, was toxic and fraught with constant turmoil. Andrew was 21, a man with a violent temper and an unhealthy relationship with alcohol. He was often described as someone who would explode at the smallest things, and his rage was as unpredictable as it was dangerous. Stephanie and Andrew's relationship was marked by arguing and conflict, a battleground that Brianna would be born into, a battlefield that would soon become her reality. Andrew wasn't just a partner to Stephanie. He was a father to Brianna. But his ability to care for her? It was non-existent. Andrew's temper, his alcoholism, his abusive nature. These were not things that could simply be overlooked. They weren't things that Brianna would ever understand, but they would shape her short life in unimaginable ways. And then there was Stephen Lopez, Stephanie's uncle. Stephen was a figure in Brianna's life who should have been a calming presence, a helping hand. But instead, he was another player in the drama that unfolded in that small, crowded home. Stephen wasn't just Stephanie's uncle. He was another enabler, another adult who would allow the violence to continue unchecked. His presence in the home created a dynamic where Andrew's influence was further entrenched, and where no one could ever step in to stop the escalating harm. Brianna's grandmother, Patricia Walters, also lived in the home. But Patricia, much like the rest of the family, turned a blind eye to what was happening. She should have been a voice of reason, someone to step up and say no when things went too far. But instead, Patricia became another passive observer, someone who witnessed the harm but did nothing to intervene. Her reluctance to act created an environment where Brianna's cries went unheard, where her suffering was ignored, and where her abusers were allowed to carry on with their twisted actions. This was Brianna's world, a world of chaos and neglect, a world where she should have been safe but was instead surrounded by danger at every turn. Brianna trusted her parents. She had no choice but to. She was a newborn, dependent on them for everything. Her trust was absolute, and she needed them to be the ones who cared for her, protected her, and gave her love. But her trust was betrayed by the very people who should have been her safe place. As Brianna lay in her crib, her small body fragile and vulnerable, her parents and family members were the ones who should have been watching over her. But instead of care, she received rough play. Actions that, for a young child, were devastating and harmful. Andrew and Stephen's behavior was no accident. They engaged in rough play with Brianna, tossing her in the air, allowing her to fall back down onto surfaces that could have caused serious injury. At first, Stephanie might have spoken up, but she never took it further. She never removed Brianna from harm. She didn't protect her. This behavior was tolerated, and in time, it became normalized within the household. Stephanie's indifference to Brianna's well-being wasn't the only factor. The lack of visibility in their lives played a huge role in the continuing abuse. Brianna was rarely seen outside. She wasn't taken to doctors regularly, nor did she attend daycare. Her absence from the public eye kept her invisible, and no one outside the family ever had the opportunity to witness the early signs of harm. Without those who could have intervened, teachers, medical professionals, family friends, no one had a chance to stop the abuse before it was too late. As the weeks and months went on, Brianna's injuries grew worse, and her pain deepened. The signs of trauma were clear, but they went unaddressed. Her life was spiraling out of control, and the very people who were supposed to protect her were, instead, the ones who caused her suffering. They were the ones who should have known better. They were the ones who should have taken action when they first saw the bruises, when they heard the cries. But they didn't. And that's where Brianna's story takes a tragic turn. Her life, so full of potential and promise, was now marked by a family that failed her. A family that betrayed the trust of the most innocent among them. And as we continue, you'll see how this story unfolds. How the family's silence, their inability to protect Brianna, would lead to consequences that would change everything. Brianna's life didn't have to end the way it did. It didn't have to be filled with fear and pain. But it was. And now we have to ask ourselves, what happened? How did it go so terribly wrong? What was missed along the way that led to this tragedy? In the next part of this journey, we'll start to uncover the signs that were ignored, the moments that could have saved Brianna, and the failures that led to her untimely death. Stay with us, because the truth behind Brianna Lopez's death is more horrifying than you could ever imagine. As we dive into Brianna's life and the tragic beginning to her story, it's heartbreaking to think about how much her family failed her. Do you think these early warning signs should have been enough to intervene? What's your take on the role of those closest to a child, like parents or relatives, when it comes to preventing abuse? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Drop a comment below, and let's talk about how we can better protect children in situations like Brianna's. I read and reply to every comment, so let's have a conversation. Also, where are you watching from today? I'm curious to know how far Brianna's story is reaching. The story of Brianna Lopez is not just about the tragedy of her death. It's about the moments leading up to that day, the signs that were ignored, and the failures of a system meant to protect her. It's about the early warning signs that no one chose to act on, the cries for help that went unanswered. It's about how everything that happened could have been prevented if anyone, had been paying attention. Child Protective Services, CPS, wasn't blind to the issues in Brianna's household. In fact, CPS had been alerted to the problems in the Lopez family long before Brianna's death. The signs were there. The system had already received reports about Stephanie Lopez and Andrew Walters and their ability to care for Brianna, or rather, their inability to. But no action was taken. Brianna's parents were no strangers to CPS investigations. Before Brianna was even born, concerns had been raised about their suitability as parents. There had been reports of instability, violence, and neglect. And yet, nothing was done to intervene. Nothing was done to remove Brianna from harm's way. Instead, the reports were filed away, and the investigation was closed without resolution. CPS had been alerted to the unhealthy environment that Brianna was about to be born into, but their response was ineffective at best and negligent at worst. It was as if the system had failed to connect the dots. How could it be that the very people entrusted with the care of an infant had already shown a history of inability and unwillingness to provide that care? As we move further into the story, you'll see how these missed opportunities would become even more heartbreaking in hindsight. When Brianna was discharged from the hospital, she seemed to be on the mend. She had survived her early fight for life and was finally sent home to her family. But this moment, which should have been one of hope, marked the beginning of her tragic decline. For a while, her parents went on as if everything was fine. Everything appeared normal. But those close to Brianna, those who were supposed to be protecting her, were missing the warning signs, dismissing them as just the typical bumps and bruises a child would get as they began to grow. It wasn't just one injury, but a pattern. A series of injuries that couldn't be explained away by a child simply growing up. Brianna's small body began to show signs of abuse. Bruises, marks, and fractures. Her body, still so fragile, began to bear the weight of the violence surrounding her. And what did her parents do? They ignored it. Stephanie Lopez, Brianna's mother, saw the bruises. She saw the marks. Yet, in her mind, they were just part of the process of raising a child. The bruises were just something that would heal over time. She dismissed them. She brushed them off. In fact, it seemed as though she refused to even acknowledge what was happening to her daughter. Why? Why would a mother ignore the obvious signs of her baby's suffering? Andrew Walters, Brianna's father, did the same. He didn't intervene. He didn't stop the cycle of harm. He didn't protect his daughter. His silence and lack of action were just as damaging as the abuse itself. They kept telling themselves that it was just part of growing up. They kept telling themselves that every child gets bruises, that every baby falls from time to time. But for Brianna, this wasn't just a few scrapes or a small fall. This was something much darker, something far worse than a typical childhood injury. Brianna's condition continued to worsen, and yet no one stepped in. No one took action. Her body was being broken down, piece by piece, and those who should have been the loudest voices in her defense stayed silent. They didn't act. They didn't protect her. What does it feel like to watch a child suffer and to do nothing about it? What kind of world are we living in when the people who should be protecting the most vulnerable among us instead become the ones inflicting the harm? In the months following her discharge, Brianna's body showed more and more signs of injury. Her tiny frame was battered, yet no one seemed to see the extent of her suffering. No one seemed to care enough to intervene. Her family continued to make excuses. The bruises? Normal. The scars? Just a part of growing up. But they weren't. Brianna's injuries weren't normal. The pain she was in wasn't just a part of childhood. She was being hurt. And everyone around her either didn't care enough to notice or chose to ignore it. The emotional frustration here is overwhelming. As a viewer, you can't help but feel the weight of the neglect. You can't help but feel the helplessness that Brianna must have felt. Her tiny body bruised and broken, her voice silenced by those who were supposed to be her greatest protectors. There's something incredibly disturbing about a mother and father who witness their child's pain, yet do nothing to stop it. There's something deeply wrong when those closest to you, the ones who are meant to love and care for you, are the ones causing you the most harm. And the silence, the inaction, that's what made it all worse. No one stepped in. No one saw the signs. Brianna was left to suffer alone. The bruises, the pain, the growing terror in her small body. No one recognized it for what it was, abuse. It was only a matter of time before something tragic happened. And when it did, it was already too late. The early warning signs were there, but they were ignored. The bruises, the scarring, the brokenness, these were not normal, and yet they went unnoticed by those who could have stopped it. How could no one intervene? When the story of Brianna Lopez is told, it's not just about her tragic end. It's about the failure of everyone around her. It's about the people who should have stepped in but chose not to. It's about how Brianna's story could have had a different ending if only the warning signs had been acknowledged, if only someone had taken action before it was too late. But the truth is, those who should have been there for her failed her. And in the end, Brianna's suffering became a tragic lesson in the danger of turning a blind eye. Comment below with your opinion, and feel free to share any thoughts or experiences you might have about child protection. I read and reply to every comment, so don't hesitate to join the conversation. Also, let me know where you're watching from. I'm always curious about the support Brianna's story is getting from all over. Brianna Lopez was a 5-month-old baby, fragile and innocent, and yet she was being subjected to the most unimaginable suffering. The signs of abuse had been there all along, yet no one took action. Her body had become a silent witness to the violence that her parents, her very own flesh and blood, were inflicting upon her. As the days passed, her condition grew worse. Her tiny frame, which should have been protected, was showing clear signs of bruising, swelling, and unexplained injuries that should have raised immediate red flags. But in the Lopez household, these signs were ignored. Brianna's body had become a canvas of pain and suffering, each bruise, each mark, a testament to the unseen horror she was enduring. The injuries were no longer just small bruises or scrapes. They were more than that. Brianna's delicate body was showing the signs of repeated trauma, multiple fractures, internal injuries, and wounds that had been inflicted over time. Yet, her parents, the very people who were supposed to protect her, did nothing to stop it. Instead, they brushed off the injuries as normal, as accidental, and continued to go on with their lives as if nothing was wrong. How does a parent look at their child's body, seeing clear signs of abuse, and choose to ignore it? How does a mother look at her baby's bruises and decide they are just part of growing up? How does a father, who should be the protector, continue to abuse his child and pretend that it's not happening? But it wasn't just the injuries. It was the lack of urgency from those who were supposed to act. The injuries kept escalating, and yet nothing changed. Brianna's condition continued to deteriorate, but no one stepped in to stop it. The silence, the indifference, the denial, it all made the situation even worse. Each moment Brianna spent in that home was a moment that she could never get back, a moment where the abuse went unchecked. Her parents' failure to act wasn't just neglect. It was a crime in itself. They saw the injuries. They knew something was wrong. But they chose to do nothing. The only thing they did was justify their actions, telling themselves that Brianna was fine, that it was just part of raising a child. But the truth was much darker. The escalating symptoms of abuse were clear, and they were undeniable. Brianna was no longer just a baby with a few bruises. She was a victim of repeated and deliberate harm. And yet, nothing was done to protect her. No intervention, no concern, no action. The silence was deafening, and it was a silence that allowed the abuse to continue. It was a silence that eventually led to her death. Then, on that fateful day, the moment came that would change everything. It was just another morning in the Lopez household. Brianna was in her crib, likely unaware of the horrors that had already consumed her life. But in this moment, everything would come to a head. Stephanie Lopez, Brianna's mother, called 911 at around 10 a.m. The words on the recording would become forever etched in the investigation. "My baby's not breathing. She fell from her crib. She's unresponsive." The paramedics arrived in a rush. It was clear that something was terribly wrong. They could feel the urgency in the air, the chaos that unfolded around them. But as they rushed to Brianna's side, something didn't make sense. Brianna's body was lifeless, cold to the touch, and the injuries they saw told a story that didn't match the one Stephanie had just described. The story of a simple fall from the crib couldn't explain what was happening. The injuries were too severe, too deliberate. They were inconsistent with the explanation that had been given. Her ribs were broken, her skull fractured, and there were bruises all over her body. The marks on Brianna's body were too numerous, too spread out to be the result of a fall. First responders quickly realized that this wasn't an accident. This wasn't just a baby who had fallen from a crib. This was something far worse. The injuries were too deliberate, too calculated. They couldn't have been caused by a simple fall. The medical staff who tried to save her soon saw the horrifying truth. Brianna's body was battered and bruised from months of sustained abuse. And yet, even as the paramedics worked frantically to save her, Stephanie Lopez remained eerily calm, almost detached from the situation. There was no sense of urgency in her voice, no real sign of the grief and panic that would be expected from a mother who had just lost her child. As Brianna was rushed to the hospital, the reality of the situation began to sink in. But it was already too late. Brianna was pronounced dead shortly after 11 a.m. Her death wasn't just a tragedy. It wasn't just a sad, isolated incident. It was a wake-up call, a horrifying reminder of what happens when abuse goes unnoticed, when the system fails, when a child is left unprotected in the very place she should have been the safest. Her own home. The discovery of Brianna's abuse was only the beginning. It was the first step in unraveling the twisted reality of what had been happening behind closed doors. But even as the paramedics and doctors worked to revive her, they had no idea what they were about to uncover. This wasn't just an accident. This was the culmination of months of deliberate harm, of physical and emotional abuse that no one had seen coming. Brianna's suffering had been ongoing, and it was only at the very end that the world would start to see the true extent of it. How many more signs could have been ignored? How much longer could this have gone on without anyone noticing? The question that haunted everyone involved was, why did no one act? And now, as we move forward in the investigation, the truth will begin to emerge, piece by piece, until we can no longer ignore the painful reality of what happened to Brianna Lopez. Thank you so much for staying with us so far, and for being part of this powerful community that's determined to raise awareness about cases like Brianna's. Your support means everything to me, and I appreciate how deeply you care about bringing justice to children like Brianna. If you feel the pain and rage I know so many of us feel, then please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and keep sharing these stories. This takes time to research, to create, and to craft with the respect it deserves. So your support keeps these stories alive and helps us keep pushing for change. And remember, turn on that notification bell, so you're always in the loop when new videos drop. You'll want to see how this story unfolds, because we're just getting started. The moment Brianna Lopez was declared dead, the investigation began. The scene was set, and the shocking reality of the case began to unfold. It wasn't just a tragic accident, as Stephanie had claimed. It wasn't just a fall from a crib that took Brianna's life. There was something far darker, something that had been hidden for months. Detective Angela Lopez was called in to lead the investigation. She walked into a scene that no one could have prepared her for, a home marked by silence, where a mother and father were supposed to protect their child, but instead they had allowed abuse to flourish. Angela was no stranger to dark cases, but the brutality of this one was hard to stomach. As she began questioning the family members, the inconsistencies in their stories became immediately apparent. Stephanie Lopez, Brianna's mother, was hesitant and vague in her responses. Her timeline didn't make sense. The details she provided didn't add up. Andrew Walters, Brianna's father, seemed to downplay the seriousness of the situation, offering weak explanations for the injuries his daughter had sustained. One of the first things that struck Angela was the lack of urgency in the family's behavior. There was no visible panic from Stephanie or Andrew. There was no frantic mother pleading for help, no father fighting to save his child. Instead, there was calmness, almost detachment. When Brianna was found unresponsive, there should have been chaos, there should have been tears, there should have been a sense of panic and desperation. But all that Angela saw was a family who had lived in denial for far too long, unable or unwilling to face the reality of their actions. The inconsistencies in the family's statements only deepened as the investigation progressed. Stephanie continued to claim that Brianna had fallen from her crib, but her explanations didn't match the medical evidence that would soon be revealed. As the days passed, Detective Lopez turned to the autopsy report, hoping to uncover answers. What she found was nothing short of horrifying. Brianna's body had been subjected to repeated violence, and the signs were clear. There were multiple fractures across her tiny frame, fractured ribs, a broken skull. These were not injuries that could have come from a fall. These were deliberate, repeated acts of violence, injuries that had been inflicted over time. The internal bleeding that was found was also a sign of severe trauma. Brianna's injuries weren't just limited to her bones. She had bruising across her body, bruising that didn't make sense for a child who had simply fallen from her crib. And there were even more disturbing signs. Medical professionals found evidence of sexual abuse, a revelation that sent shockwaves through the entire investigation. Brianna, a 2-month-old infant, had been subjected to unspeakable acts. The fact that her family, the very people who were supposed to care for her, had inflicted such violence upon her was beyond comprehension. With the autopsy findings in hand, the investigation took on a new direction. This was no longer just a case of neglect or a tragic accident. This was a case of sustained abuse, of systematic violence that had been going on for months, possibly longer. Brianna's body had become the silent witness to the cruelty she had faced at the hands of those who should have protected her. The crime scene photos told a story that words alone couldn't capture. The evidence was overwhelming. Clear signs of bruising, fractures, and swelling that indicated the level of abuse Brianna had endured. The images painted a picture of a child left unprotected, of a family unable or unwilling to stop the violence. Every photo, every piece of evidence added to the growing understanding of just how much Brianna had suffered. As Detective Lopez continued her investigation, the focus shifted from a simple case of neglect to something much darker. The more she uncovered, the clearer it became that Brianna's suffering had been ongoing. The violence wasn't isolated. It was systematic, and it had been happening for months. The investigation was no longer about just one incident. It was about a pattern of harm. It was about a cycle of abuse that no one had noticed. The family, who had been entrusted with Brianna's care, had allowed her to suffer in silence, and the lack of intervention from those who could have helped was becoming more and more glaring. Stephanie, Andrew, and Stephen had all been complicit in this abuse. They knew what was happening. They were aware of the injuries, the bruises, and the suffering. But instead of seeking help, they had remained silent. They had allowed the abuse to continue, each one playing a part in the horror that unfolded behind the walls of their home. As the investigation deepened, more shocking revelations came to light. Witness testimonies began to paint a clearer picture of what had been happening inside the Lopez household. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out came forward, sharing their concerns about the family. Others revealed details about the behavior they had witnessed, about the rough play that had turned violent, about the neglect that had gone unnoticed. The pattern of harm was becoming undeniable. And as more evidence was uncovered, it became clear that Brianna's death was not just the result of a single tragic moment. It was the culmination of months, possibly years, of abuse, and the failure of the system to intervene when it mattered most. The emotional toll on the investigators was also evident. Detective Lopez, who had seen countless cases of violence and abuse, found herself struggling to keep her emotions in check. The details of Brianna's suffering were so intense, so heartbreaking, that even the most seasoned investigators couldn't hold back their tears. Brianna's story wasn't just another case to be solved. It was a story of a child who had been let down by everyone who was supposed to protect her. With every new piece of evidence, with every new revelation, the case grew more disturbing. The abuse was not just physical. It was psychological, emotional, and sexual. Brianna had been subjected to horrors that no child should ever have to endure. And as the investigation unfolded, the truth became more and more shocking. This was no longer just a case of neglect. It was a case of unimaginable cruelty, of betrayal and violence at the hands of the very people who should have been Brianna's protectors. As the investigation continued to unravel the horrific truths behind Brianna Lopez's death, the question that haunted everyone involved was clear. How could something like this happen? In the next act, we'll dive deeper into the investigation and the shocking twist that turned everything on its head. What secrets had been hidden behind the closed doors of the Lopez household? What truths would the investigators uncover that would shock the world? Stay with us, because the story is just getting started. The investigation into Brianna Lopez's death had already taken a darker turn, with every piece of evidence leading to an increasingly shocking conclusion. But just when it seemed like the case was beginning to make sense, a new revelation would completely change the direction of the investigation. What was once thought to be a tragic accident was now being revealed as something far more sinister. And just as investigators thought they were on the right track, a twist would leave them, and the viewers, shocked and questioning everything they had believed. It started with a seemingly insignificant piece of information, a detail that had been overlooked in the early stages of the investigation. A neighbor who had remained in the shadows of the investigation suddenly came forward with crucial information. This neighbor had overheard an argument between Andrew Walters and Stephanie Lopez, Brianna's parents, just weeks before the incident. At first, this may have seemed like just another argument between a couple dealing with personal struggles. But as the neighbor described the heated exchange, it quickly became clear that this wasn't just a domestic dispute. No, this was something deeper, more troubling. The argument wasn't just about money or relationship issues. It was about how to care for Brianna, a baby who, according to the neighbor, had already been showing signs of distress and suffering. The words exchanged during that argument didn't just point to a family in turmoil. They painted a terrifying picture of a household where violence was simmering just below the surface. The neighbor described hearing shouting and accusations, with Stephanie's voice rising in frustration. It became clear that Brianna's care, something that should have been a basic act of love and protection, was a point of contention between the parents. And, disturbingly, the way the argument unfolded painted a picture of parents who weren't even considering the well-being of their child. Instead, they were arguing about who was at fault for Brianna's distress, with no true recognition of the gravity of the situation. This testimony became the turning point in the investigation. For the first time, investigators began to see the true nature of the dysfunction within the Lopez household. This wasn't just a couple struggling to care for their child. This was a family where abuse and neglect had been simmering for far too long. The argument was a reflection of the deeper issues at play, an environment where violence was becoming a way of life. Until now, the case had been thought of as a tragic accident, perhaps an instance of rough play gone too far. But this new testimony made it clear. Brianna's death wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a bigger picture. The signs had been there, and they had been ignored. But now, with this new information, the investigation had to take a much darker turn. And then came the most shocking twist of all. Just when the investigation thought it had all the answers, a buried truth emerged about Andrew Walters' violent past, a past that had been carefully concealed by those who should have been held accountable. As investigators dug deeper into Andrew Walters' history, they uncovered a trail of previous abuse allegations that had never been addressed, much less investigated. For years, Andrew had been involved in violent incidents, from domestic abuse to allegations of aggression toward others. Yet, despite these patterns of violence, there had been no intervention, no consequences. The system had failed to protect those who were most vulnerable. The shocking part: Andrew had a history, one that his family and close friends knew about but chose to ignore. The violent temper, the alcohol abuse, the outbursts of rage, all of these were well known within the Lopez household, but no one had taken action. Instead, they all turned a blind eye, leaving Brianna to face the consequences. When the pieces began to fall into place, investigators realized that Andrew Walters had been escalating his violence for years, and Brianna was simply the latest victim in a pattern of abuse that no one had ever bothered to stop. The signs had been there all along, but the system had failed to intervene before it was too late. The disturbing part of this revelation was that Andrew's violent past wasn't just a series of isolated incidents. No, this was part of a larger pattern, one that had escalated over time, and no one had stepped in to put a stop to it. The arguments with Stephanie, the rough play with Brianna, the bruises and injuries that were ignored, all of these were symptoms of a much larger problem. Andrew wasn't just a man with a temper. He was someone who had been violent for years, and he had found ways to hide it. His violent tendencies had been hidden beneath the surface, masked by a facade of normalcy, and his actions had remained unchecked because no one was paying attention. As the investigation dug deeper into Andrew's past, it became clear that this was no random act of violence. This was the culmination of years of untreated rage and a lack of accountability that allowed him to continue hurting those closest to him. The true horror of the situation was that this wasn't a one-time incident. It was a repeated pattern of neglect and abuse, with no one willing to step in. And as each revelation surfaced, the horror of what had been happening inside that home became more and more undeniable. In the midst of all of this, one undeniable truth began to surface. Brianna Lopez had been failed by every system that was supposed to protect her. Her family had failed her. Her parents, her uncle, even her grandmother. None of them stepped in to intervene. They had all known about the violence, the arguments, and the abuse, yet they allowed it to continue. The silence within that household allowed the violence to flourish unchecked. And when it finally reached a tragic conclusion, there was no one there to stop it. Detective Lopez now understood that this wasn't just a case of neglect. It was a case of escalating violence that had been allowed to continue for far too long. Brianna wasn't just the victim of a single incident. She was the victim of a family that had been caught in a cycle of abuse for years. The shocking revelation of Andrew Walter's violent past was the final piece of the puzzle, the one that forced everyone to rethink what they had believed about the case. It wasn't just an isolated tragedy. It was the result of years of unchecked violence. Brianna's death was the tragic consequence of a broken system, a system that had failed to protect her and allowed her abusers to go unpunished. As the investigation continued, more evidence was uncovered, and it became clearer than ever. Brianna's death wasn't a random accident. It was the result of deliberate abuse, sustained neglect, and a failure of the system to intervene when it mattered most. The truth was finally starting to emerge, and it was shocking. This was just the beginning of the unraveling of a family, a community, and a justice system that had failed to protect a vulnerable child. The truth was out, and it was more disturbing than anyone could have ever imagined. The next part would explore the psychological factors behind this abuse, why it happened, what drove the perpetrators, and how this pattern of violence continued without anyone stopping it. Stay tuned, because what comes next is the unraveling of a story that will leave you speechless. Brianna Lopez's case wasn't just another story of abuse, it was a story of unresolved trauma, neglect, and a toxic family dynamic that ultimately led to a tragedy no one could have predicted. To truly understand how something so horrific could happen, we need to examine the minds of the perpetrators, the environment in which they existed, and the forces that drove them to commit these unspeakable acts. Let's start with Stephanie Lopez, Brianna's mother. On the surface, Stephanie seemed like any other 19-year-old mother, trying to navigate life with a young child. But when you dig deeper into her history, you start to see the cracks beneath the surface. Stephanie's life had been marked by instability, and the pressures of raising a child in such a chaotic environment were evident. She was raised in a dysfunctional household, where emotional neglect was a daily reality. Her relationship with Andrew Walters, Brianna's father, was volatile at best. They struggled with constant arguments, financial instability, and emotional strain. Stephanie had been exposed to violence growing up, which may have conditioned her to accept unhealthy relationships as normal. For someone like Stephanie, who had never received proper emotional support or therapy, it was easy for her to dissociate from the horrors happening right under her roof. Denial became her coping mechanism, a way to protect herself from the harsh truth. Instead of recognizing the early signs of abuse, she chose to ignore them. After all, facing the reality of the situation would mean confronting her own deep-seated trauma, something she wasn't ready to do. And so, her detachment grew. It wasn't that she didn't love Brianna, perhaps she did, But her inability to care properly for her was rooted in her inability to properly care for herself. And then there was Andrew Walters, Brianna's father. He was just 21, but his life had already been shaped by violence and alcoholism. Andrew's rage wasn't something new. His past was littered with allegations of abuse, all of which had been swept under the rug. But when a person grows up in an environment where anger and alcohol are commonplace, it becomes easier to justify abusive behavior, even to oneself. Andrew's history of violent outbursts was more than just a personality flaw. It was a symptom of something far deeper. Addiction, combined with a lack of emotional regulation, created a ticking time bomb. His capacity for violence had been normalized by years of toxic behavior in his own family. His relationship with Stephanie was one of constant power struggles. In his mind, his temper was an effective means of control. Yet, it wasn't just anger that drove him, it was also the power he gained from it. Andrew saw himself as the dominant force in the household, and violence was his way of asserting that dominance. But anger wasn't the only thing that fueled his actions. Guilt, shame, and insecurity were also buried deep within him. His childhood had been filled with broken promises and unhealed wounds. And these emotions simmered under the surface, leading to an eruption of violence when they were triggered by stress, substance abuse, or perceived challenges to his authority. Now, let's examine the broader environment in which Brianna lived, the very family dynamic that fostered her abuse. Alcoholism, violence, and emotional neglect had been the hallmark of this family's existence. Stephanie and Andrew, as young parents, had never been given the proper tools to care for their child. They were young, disconnected, and underprepared. In a home where violence was the answer to conflict, it's easy to see how this behavior was passed on to their children. Brianna was born into a household where the emotional well-being of the child wasn't a priority. The cycle of abuse continued because no one in the family knew how to break it. Stephanie was deeply entangled in this dysfunctional system. She didn't have the skills or emotional support to confront the abuse or seek help. Instead, she relied on denial, brushing off the signs of violence as if they were trivial. She didn't protect Brianna because she hadn't been taught what it meant to protect herself, let alone another human being. The abuse, in her mind, was just a part of life, something she had endured and now passed on to her daughter. Andrew didn't just fail to protect Brianna, he actively participated in her abuse. His lack of empathy and emotional maturity prevented him from seeing the harm he was causing. Instead, he chose to justify his actions. Rough play, in his mind, was just a form of bonding. But in reality, it was torture, and his repeated violent behavior became a systematic method of asserting control. In this environment, there was one more key figure: Patricia Walters, Brianna's grandmother. Patricia played a passive role in this tragedy. Despite living in the household and being privy to what was going on, she failed to act. She had witnessed Brianna's suffering firsthand but remained silent. She chose not to intervene, perhaps out of fear or a misguided loyalty to her son, Andrew. Patricia's lack of action wasn't just an oversight, it was complicity. She allowed the abuse to continue by refusing to speak out or take steps to protect Brianna. Patricia's inaction speaks volumes about the dysfunction within this family. It's clear that when it came to addressing abuse, everyone was either afraid, unwilling, or too emotionally detached to confront the horror that was happening in front of them. This was the environment Brianna Lopez was born into, an environment filled with unresolved trauma, neglect, and violence. These were the circumstances that led to her death. Her family failed to recognize the severity of the situation. They failed to see her suffering as anything more than a normal part of life. And, tragically, Brianna became a part of that cycle. The cycle of abuse is often invisible to those caught in it. Family members normalize harmful behaviors, and children are left to absorb the damage. In the Lopez Walters household, Brianna was trapped in this cycle, a victim of a family that didn't know how to care for her. Every day, she endured pain and suffering, but no one in the household had the strength to break free of the cycle. The lack of intervention and the refusal to acknowledge the harm being done ensured that the violence continued, day after day, until it became too late. The psychological toll this environment took on Brianna cannot be overstated. She was just a child, a vulnerable, helpless infant, but she was forced to endure a level of cruelty that most adults would never even imagine. Her life was stolen by the very people who were supposed to love and protect her. As we examine the psychological aspects of this case, we are left with one question. How could this happen? How could parents, family members, and loved ones fail to protect an innocent child? How could the system fail her? Brianna's story is a tragic reminder of the impact of unresolved trauma and the danger of an abusive family environment. The consequences of living in such a toxic atmosphere are profound, and Brianna Lopez paid the ultimate price. Her death was not just the result of neglect, it was the result of a pattern of abuse that had been allowed to go unchecked for far too long. The cycle of abuse is not just about the physical harm inflicted on the victim. It's about the emotional toll it takes on everyone involved. The family dynamic, which included silence, denial, and emotional neglect, became the breeding ground for violence. And in this case, it led to a tragic loss, a loss that could have been prevented had anyone recognized the signs or chosen to act. As we continue to uncover the truth behind Brianna's death, we will explore the legal proceedings, the trial, and the justice that followed. But the psychological impact of her death will forever haunt those involved, reminding us of the devastating consequences of failing to protect our most vulnerable. In the next part, we will look at the trial, where the family members responsible for Brianna's death faced the consequences of their actions. The courtroom drama will unfold, revealing how justice was sought and whether it was enough. Stay tuned as the story of Brianna Lopez takes another heartbreaking turn. The courtroom was filled with tension. The air heavy, the walls echoing with the sounds of grief, pain, and anger. As the trial of Andrew Walters, Stephanie Lopez, and Stephen Lopez unfolded, it became more than just a case. It became the representation of every failure in the child protection system that led to Brianna Lopez's death. The trial of Brianna's family members was nothing short of a heartbreaking spectacle. The evidence presented in court painted a chilling picture of abuse, neglect, and betrayal. As each piece of evidence was shown, the full horror of Brianna's last days came to light, causing many in the courtroom, including seasoned officers, to break down in tears. Brianna's suffering was not just physical. It was emotional, psychological, and systemic. The emotional testimonies from doctors, social workers, and family members painted a disturbing picture of a little girl trapped in an environment that should have been the safest place for her. The medical examiner took the stand, describing the extent of Brianna's injuries. Multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and signs of sexual abuse that were not just isolated incidents but the result of sustained harm over a period of months. As the prosecution laid out the timeline, it became evident that this was not a single tragic accident. It was a case of ongoing violence. The most gut-wrenching part of the trial came from the emotional testimonies of the medical staff and detectives who had worked tirelessly on the case. They were the ones who had seen the bruises, the broken bones, the fear in Brianna's eyes. They had witnessed firsthand the failure of those who should have protected her. The medical examiner's statement was chilling. Brianna Lopez's injuries were not the result of a fall. They were caused by repeated trauma. Trauma that could only have come from the hands of someone she trusted. In the courtroom, Andrew Walters and Stephanie Lopez sat stoically as the evidence mounted against them. But no one in the room could ignore the reality of what they had done. It was clear to everyone. The violent outbursts, the neglect, the absence of intervention. All of it had led to Brianna's death. The emotional testimony of Brianna's grandmother, Patricia Walters, was difficult to hear. She admitted that she had seen the signs of abuse, had witnessed her own son, Andrew, tossing Brianna into the air and roughhousing with her, but she had stayed silent. She had failed to act. The failure to protect was a running theme throughout the trial. Patricia's words weighed heavily in the room. She expressed deep regret and guilt, but it was too late for regret. The damage had been done, and Brianna was no longer there to defend herself. The court proceedings took a definitive turn when the defendants were confronted with the hard facts. The evidence was overwhelming. Andrew Walters had admitted to rough play with Brianna, but his story was falling apart. The defense team tried to present the abuse as an unfortunate accident, but the medical reports were clear. Brianna's injuries weren't accidental. Her ribs, skull, and limbs showed signs of abuse at different stages. There was no explanation for the severe bruising on her face, the torn skin, the fractures that had been inflicted repeatedly. Stephanie Lopez, Brianna's mother, was equally culpable. Her failure to act when she saw Brianna suffering, her reluctance to seek help, and her inability to protect her daughter placed her at the center of this tragedy. Stephen Lopez, the uncle, was also held accountable. His involvement in the abuse, his willingness to participate in the rough play and harm Brianna, sealed his fate. The defense tried to argue that Stephen was merely following his brother's lead, but it was clear that he, too, was responsible for allowing Brianna's suffering to continue. The jury deliberated, but there was little doubt about the outcome. The convictions were handed down, and the family members who had failed Brianna, Andrew Walters, Stephanie Lopez, and Stephen Lopez, were left to face the consequences of their actions. Andrew Walters was convicted of capital murder, and he was sentenced to 63 years in prison. Stephanie Lopez was convicted of negligent homicide and sentenced to 27 years in prison. Her lack of intervention, her failure to protect her child, and her enabling behavior towards Andrew and Stephen played a significant role in Brianna's death. Stephen Lopez, who had participated in the abuse, was sentenced to 57 years in prison for his involvement in Brianna's abuse and death. As the verdicts were read and the families began to leave the courtroom, it was impossible to ignore the systemic failures that had led to Brianna's death. Brianna's case wasn't just about a family's betrayal. It was about a system that had failed her. Child Protective Services, CPS, had been involved with Brianna's family before her birth, and there had been concerns raised about the family's stability. But despite multiple warnings, no intervention had been made. Brianna had fallen through the cracks, her abuse hidden behind closed doors. In the courtroom, there was no escaping the truth. The system had failed. Neighbors had seen nothing. Teachers hadn't noticed the signs. And even medical professionals, who might have been able to intervene, were never given the chance to see the truth. Brianna's death was a stark reminder of just how vulnerable children can be when they have no one to protect them. In the wake of this heartbreaking case, lawmakers were compelled to take action. Baby Brianna Law was introduced and passed in 2007 as a direct result of this tragedy. The law mandates life sentences for those convicted of causing the death of a child under the age of 13 due to severe abuse. The law was designed to ensure that future cases like Brianna's would not be met with leniency. The goal was to send a message that child abuse would not be tolerated, and those who caused a child's death through abuse would face the most severe consequences. Brianna's story was a catalyst for change, and baby Brianna Law became a beacon of hope for children everywhere who might be suffering in silence. While the legal system has taken steps to ensure justice for victims like Brianna, the scars left by her death remain. Brianna Lopez's life was tragically cut short, and no amount of justice could bring her back. But Brianna's story is not one that should be forgotten. Her legacy lives on in the changes that have been made to protect children from abuse, and in the lessons we've learned about the importance of vigilance and action. We are left to reflect on the reality of this case. Brianna was let down by those she trusted the most. Her death serves as a painful reminder that no child is safe unless there is someone looking out for them. It's a reminder that we must stay vigilant, that we must speak up when we see red flags, and that we must protect the children who cannot protect themselves. As we come to the end of Brianna Lopez's tragic story, it's important to reflect on the changes her case has sparked, and how we all have a role in protecting future generations from suffering. I want to take a moment to thank every single one of you who has been with me throughout this journey. Your support is invaluable, and the impact we can make together is undeniable. These stories take time to research, produce, and share, and I couldn't do it without all of you who are making this channel a space for truth and awareness. If you believe that children deserve to be protected and that justice must be served, please like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear Brianna's story. Every share counts in our fight for a safer world for kids like Brianna. Turn on the notification bell to ensure you're the first to hear about our next video, because there are more untold stories that need your voice. Together we can make a real difference. Thank you for being here, and for keeping Brianna's memory alive. Thank you for watching.